I never imagined a single sentence from my own child could split my world in half. But that Christmas Eve, it did. One moment I was setting the table, hoping for a quiet holiday, and the next, I was staring into the eyes of the person I loved most, hearing words sharp enough to carve a wound I was not prepared for. It was the kind of hurt that lingers, the kind that shakes years of love, sacrifice, and unspoken tenderness. And in that instant, I knew nothing in our family would ever be the same again. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're tuning in from. We love seeing how our stories connect people from all around the world. Your comments and thoughts bring this community to life, and we're so grateful to have you on this journey with us. If you haven't already, do not forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, grab a cozy seat, maybe a cup of coffee or tea, and prepare yourself for a tale that will captivate your heart from beginning to end. Let's begin. My name is Elaine Whitmore, and at 62 years old, I have learned that winter has a way of exposing both the strength and the loneliness in a person. Lake Placid, New York, where I have lived for more than 3 decades, becomes a world of white from December through March. The lake freezes into a sheet of glass. The wind slides between the pine trees like a whispered warning, and my wooden cabin sits on the shoreline as quietly as an old friend. After my husband passed away 3 years ago, the cabin became more than a home. It became a memory box, a sanctuary, and at times a reminder of how long a day can feel when no one calls your name. Inside, nothing much has changed since he left. His photographs still line the hallway, catching the morning light in their dusty frames. The quilt he loved is still folded on the sofa. In the kitchen, the recipe cards he wrote in his careful cursive sit in a wooden box next to the stove. I touch them more often than I care to admit, as if the ink might still carry some trace of warmth from his hands. The cabin can become unbearably quiet, but keeping these pieces of him close helps me feel grounded, like the floor beneath me is steady even when the world tilts. This year, though, something feels different. For the first time in 4 years, both of my children agreed to come home for Christmas. The thought of that alone kept me busy all week. I dusted corners no one would ever look at, polished the silverware, and scrubbed the windows until they gleamed. I decorated the tree the way their father always did, placing the angel on top only after stepping back 3 times to check the symmetry. The kitchen came alive again as I prepared the old family dishes: New England beef roast, honey ham, mashed potatoes, herbed bread, and the apple pie that became something of a signature for me back when I still owned the little bakery in town. I wanted everything to be perfect, partly because Christmas mattered to their father, and partly because I needed my children to see that this home still had space for them. Lydia, my eldest, is a 38-year-old attorney in New York City. She has always been brilliant, forceful, ambitious, and relentless in ways that both impress and intimidate me. Evan, my youngest, is 32, a musician in Albany who lives with more passion than stability. They are opposites in nearly every way, yet both pieces of my heart. On the morning of December 24th, I heard tires crunching over snow and rushed to the front door. Lydia stepped out first, shaking powder from her wool coat, followed by her husband Mark, carrying several bags. Their 2 children bounded up the porch steps with the energy that only young kids possess. Lydia smiled, but it was a thin, rushed smile, the kind you give when your mind is still somewhere else. Her eyes scanned the cabin as she walked in, taking in the decorations, the tree, the old furniture, as if measuring how out of place she might feel here. Evan arrived soon after, his coat unzipped, cheeks bright from the cold, guitar case slung over his shoulder. He hugged me with both arms, holding on a second longer than usual. For a moment, with all of them under my roof again, I felt a warmth I had not felt in years. I stood on the threshold, caught between the icy air outside and the comfort inside, and I allowed myself to believe that this Christmas might bring us closer again. I did not know that the peace of that moment was only the calm before a storm I never saw coming. If you're still watching and want to see how everything slowly unravels from here, please comment number 1 below so I know you're with me. Now let's move on to chapter 2. The moment everyone stepped inside and the cold air settled behind the closed door, I expected that familiar rhythm of family slipping back into place. Instead, before coats were even hung and boots shaken free of snow, Lydia marched straight into the kitchen, unzipped her leather tote, and spread a stack of receipts across my wooden table as if she were preparing evidence for a hearing. The papers fanned out in neat rows: grocery totals, wine costs, decorations, gift receipts, and a printed spreadsheet with color-coded highlights. It struck me how sharply the sterile white slips of paper contrasted with the warmth of my pine cabinets and the soft glow from the Christmas lights. I stood near the counter, wiping my hands on my apron, trying to catch my breath from the whirlwind arrival. Lydia did not pause long enough to notice. She moved with the clipped efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this moment, sliding her finger down each receipt as though checking for errors. She announced the list of expenses in a measured tone, the kind of tone she used in court: the turkey, the ham, the wine, the candles, the garland, the cookie cutters, even the extra baking sheets. It was as if the cost of the holiday needed to be displayed and classified, not enjoyed. I tried to lighten the moment by reminding her that I had spent days preparing, cooking, cleaning, planning every dish and detail. I hoped she would look up, soften, or at least acknowledge the effort behind the food simmering on the stove. Instead, she lifted her eyes only long enough to deliver a thin smile and return to her audit. When she opened the cabinet and pulled out the old recipe book her father and I had made together, she shook her head slightly. She commented that people did not cook this way anymore, as though the pages were relics of a time better left behind. The words stung more than they should have. I felt that familiar tug between wanting to defend the past and knowing that Lydia had long since moved on from it. Still, it was strange how quickly a holiday could start to feel like a negotiation. She moved next to the dining room, adjusting the placement of chairs, folding the napkins again, and suggesting that the tablecloth looked outdated. She inspected the ornaments on the tree, as if evaluating whether they matched a theme she had curated. I watched her walk through the cabin like someone conducting an inspection rather than coming home. It was hard not to notice the way her eyes lingered critically on everything that made this place feel like mine. When Evan arrived moments later, the atmosphere shifted slightly. He wrapped his arms around me with a warmth that felt almost exaggerated against the tension Lydia had brought in. He commented on how the cabin smelled exactly the way it used to. His presence offered a small breath of relief, a reminder that the house still held meaning for at least one of my children. Yet even that relief was short-lived. Lydia spoke again about how she had paid for everything this year, letting the words hang between us with the weight of an unspoken accusation. As the family settled into the living room, I watched the scene quietly. The children chased each other around the tree, Mark stacked firewood near the hearth, and Lydia leaned over her phone, answering messages even though she had promised to take the holiday off. I sat in my favorite chair, hands clasped, trying to understand the feeling gathering beneath my ribs. A sense of imbalance, of something shifting. Lydia's voice, her movements, her insistence on control all carried an edge I could not name. I looked around the cabin glowing with lights, candles, and familiar objects, searching for the warmth I usually felt this time of year. But in the reflection of the window, I saw Lydia's expression as she observed the room, sharp and restless, as though she were bracing for something. That was when I realized that a quiet storm had begun long before the snow outside, and it was already moving toward us. If you're still following along and the tension is starting to hit you too, comment number 2 below to let me know you're staying with the story. Now let's continue with chapter 3. The dining room glowed with the warm, golden light that only Christmas Eve seems able to produce. The candles flickered gently, casting soft shadows across the wooden walls of the cabin. Outside, snow drifted in thick waves, brushing against the windows like feathers. The house felt tucked away from the world, wrapped in a cocoon of holiday comfort. I had spent the entire day preparing the meal, checking the oven every few minutes, adjusting the seasoning, laying out the platters the way my husband used to. As I carried the final dish to the table, I paused in the doorway to take in the sight of my family gathered around. For a brief moment, everything felt whole. The roast glistened beneath the kitchen lights, the mashed potatoes were whipped perfectly smooth, and the apple pie cooling near the window filled the room with a scent so familiar it made my chest ache. I set down the serving spoon beside the platter, and for a heartbeat, it felt like the years had rolled back. I imagined my husband seated at the end of the table, smiling as he always did on nights like this. I could almost hear his voice reminding everyone to be grateful for the meal, grateful for each other, grateful for small miracles in the midst of long winters. We took our seats, and I cleared my throat to begin our traditional blessing. It was something my husband had always done, and after he passed, the responsibility fell to me. I felt the weight of the ritual, the continuity, the small thread pulling us together across time. I folded my hands and drew in a breath. Before a single word left my mouth, Lydia pushed her chair back and rose to her feet. The scraping sound cut through the stillness and made the children glance up from their plates. She lifted her wine glass slightly, tapping it once with the edge of her ring. The crisp sound echoed across the table. The mood shifted. The warmth I had worked so hard to cultivate faltered as a thin coldness crept in. Lydia stood with the posture she used in courtrooms, shoulders squared, expression composed, gaze unwavering. She began speaking about responsibility and fairness, not the emotional kind, but the financial kind. Her tone carried the clipped rhythm of legal arguments, not the cadence of a daughter addressing her mother. Then came the moment that split the night in two. She looked at me directly, her eyes sharp, her voice steady, and delivered the words that would lodge themselves deep inside me. She declared that I had not paid for the meal, that I had not covered any of the expenses for the holiday, and that because of that, I did not deserve to take leftovers home the way I always did. She said, I deserved nothing. Silence fell over the table with a heaviness that pressed against my ribs. Evan stiffened beside me, but his protest faded almost instantly when Lydia ignored him. Mark stared at the tablecloth as though the pattern might offer him instructions. The children watched the adults with wide, confused eyes. No one reached for my hand. No one said that she had gone too far. I sat frozen, unable to move, unable to speak. My chest tightened with a shock so sharp it felt physical. The room, moments earlier full of warmth, now felt cold and foreign. I looked from face to face, searching for the smallest sign of support, but every gaze slid away from mine. A dull ringing filled my ears. I had never felt so alone in my own home. As the moment stretched on, something heavy settled inside me. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a slip of the tongue or a careless remark. It was the first crack in a night that would change everything, the first sign of a storm building quietly beneath the surface of my family. If you're still here and felt that moment cut a little too close to real life, comment number 3 so I know you're still watching. Now, let's head into chapter 4. For a long moment after Lydia's declaration, the entire room felt suspended, as if the air itself was waiting to see what I would do. I sat there gripping my fork, willing my face to remain neutral. The last thing I wanted was to turn the evening into something even more fractured than it already was. So I forced myself to move. I rose from the table, smoothing the front of my apron, pretending I had intended to fetch the gravy all along. The simple act of walking back into the kitchen gave me a few seconds to steady my breath and settle the ache in my chest. The kitchen, which only an hour earlier had been full of the pleasant chaos of holiday cooking, now felt hollow. I kept my hands busy, lifting the saucepan, stirring the remaining gravy, wiping counters that did not need wiping. Anything to avoid thinking about the words that had cut through the evening like a cold draft. I heard the muffled murmur of conversation from the dining room. No one had followed me. No one had called after me. The loneliness pressed deep, but I pushed it aside and returned to the table with the gravy boat. I placed it down gently and managed a small smile. I reminded Lydia softly that the night was meant to be warm and peaceful, hoping she might meet me halfway. She only gave a curt nod without looking at me. Her posture remained stiff, her expression shielded by a polished calm that felt impenetrable. Whatever had driven her to speak that way, she was not ready to soften it. As the meal continued, the conversation drifted around me like a current I could not step into. Mark asked about the winter sports season in town. The children chattered about sledding. Evan attempted to lighten the mood, but each attempt fell flat in the strained atmosphere that lingered. I ate quietly, each bite tasting like little more than texture. The glow of the candles no longer felt warm. The room felt narrower, as if the walls themselves sensed the tension. When dinner ended, the family drifted to the living room to exchange gifts. I stayed behind, collecting plates, scrubbing pans, stacking leftovers I knew I would not be taking home this year. The sounds from the other room were faint, softened by the distance but unmistakably light-hearted. It was strange how quickly the mood shifted when I was no longer in the room. I focused on the rhythm of washing, rinsing, drying, letting the familiar motions calm me, yet my mind refused to settle. That was when I heard Lydia's voice coming from the hallway, low but intense. I paused, my hands still in the warm dishwater. Her tone carried a tightness I had rarely heard, even in her most demanding cases. She spoke of a malpractice settlement, of $70,000, of the possibility of losing the apartment she worked so hard to afford. Each word landed with a thud. So this was the storm beneath her surface. This was the pressure pressing down on her chest. My heart sank. It explained her edge, her coldness, but it did not erase the sting of her earlier words. A mixture of sorrow and confusion washed over me. I wanted to comfort her. I wanted to tell her she did not have to carry everything alone. I dried my hands and walked slowly toward her door, raising my fist to knock. Before I could, her weary voice drifted through the wood, telling someone on the phone that she did not want to talk to anyone else tonight. My hand hovered in the air, then dropped. I stepped back. Later, with the house quiet, I sat alone at the kitchen table and ate a small piece of cold pie, not because I was hungry, but because the ritual grounded me. The lights on the tree flickered faintly in the next room. The house felt enormous, as if I were the only person inside it, and for the first time that night, I understood with painful clarity that what had happened at dinner was not simply about leftovers. It was a fracture, one that reached far deeper than either of us had admitted. If you're still watching and the family conflict has you leaning in, comment number 4 below to show you're still with me. Now let's move forward to Chapter 5. Christmas morning arrived with the sky the color of steel. The wind pressed hard against the cabin walls, rattling the windows as if trying to force its way inside. I woke to a chill that crept beneath the bedroom door, the kind of cold that told me something was wrong even before my feet touched the floor. When I stepped into the hallway, the house felt strangely muted. The familiar hum of the heater was gone. The lamps did not respond when I flicked their switches. It took only a moment to realize the power had failed. In the living room, the family gathered in the dim gray light filtering through the frosted windows. Our breath hovered faintly in the air as we spoke. The storm had thickened overnight, blanketing the trees and roof in heavy ice. Snow fell in relentless waves, and the radio confirmed what we suspected. A downed line somewhere near the lake had cut electricity to several homes, including mine. It was an inconvenience under normal circumstances, but today it felt like another piece of the fragile equilibrium slipping out of place. We wrapped ourselves in blankets, moved closer to the fireplace, and tried to strategize how to keep the house warm. The children huddled together, Evan gathered logs, and Mark inspected the emergency candles I kept in a drawer. For a moment, the situation created a rare form of togetherness, the kind born from shared discomfort. But as soon as the practical concerns began to settle, Lydia broke the temporary calm. She stood near the fireplace, arms crossed tightly, her posture rigid. She surveyed the room with a critical eye, noting every flaw as though cataloging evidence in a case. The old wiring, the draft beneath the door, the insulation that no longer held the warmth the way it once did. Her frustration seeped into the room like cold air through a cracked window. I listened as she commented on how outdated everything was, as if the age of the house were a personal failing of mine. Her next words cut far deeper. She said the cabin was too old, too demanding, too unsafe for someone my age to manage alone through winter. Then she said perhaps it was time to sell the house. She said it plainly, without hesitation, as though it were the logical conclusion to reach after a minor power outage. My heart sank. This house held the last pieces of the life I built with my husband. Every beam and floorboard contained a memory. The thought of losing it felt like losing him all over again. I excused myself to fetch more blankets from the small room my husband once used as an office. The door creaked as I opened it, letting in a sliver of cold hallway air. On the desk, Lydia's laptop glowed faintly, its battery still holding. I had no intention of invading her privacy, but the screen was angled toward me, and a subject line in bold letters caught my eye before I could look away. Regarding sale of Lake Placid property. My breath caught. I stepped closer, unable to stop myself. Lines of text blurred and sharpened as I read. It was all there. The estimated value of my home, the suggested timeline for sale, the procedural steps for handling ownership. My name appeared again and again, not as a participant, but as an obstacle to work around. I stood frozen, fingers pressed to my lips, as disbelief gave way to a swelling sense of betrayal. Evan entered quietly, searching for the portable battery pack. He saw the screen, then saw my face. Anger crossed his features so quickly it startled me. He did not hesitate. He stormed out of the room, his boots thudding against the wooden steps as he descended. Voices rose from the living room. His tone was sharp, demanding answers, while hers carried a brittle defensiveness that sounded ready to shatter. I remained at the top of the stairs, gripping the railing, listening as the storm outside roared in unison with the turmoil inside. Lydia insisted she had no choice, that selling the house made sense, that she was thinking of my safety. Evan accused her of using me to solve her financial troubles. Mark tried to calm them, but the tension was too high. I felt like the floor beneath me was shifting, like I was standing at the center of a storm I had never invited. By the time I reached the bottom step, one truth had settled in my chest with devastating clarity. What was happening was no longer about dinner, or leftovers, or even a moment of anger. It was about my life, my home, my worth. And the conflict had burst into something none of us could ignore any longer. The house settled into an uneasy silence after the outburst, the kind of silence that hums against the walls and makes the air feel heavier than it should. I remained on the last step of the staircase for several seconds, one hand gripping the railing as if steadying myself against a sudden shift in gravity. Below me, my two children stood on opposite sides of the room, both breathing hard, both shaken in very different ways. The storm outside continued to lash against the windows, but the storm inside the cabin felt louder, more immediate, more personal. Evan paced near the fireplace, his shoulders tight, his jaw set in a way that reminded me of his father when he was trying to protect something he loved. Lydia stood near the sofa, arms wrapped tightly around herself, as if the room had dropped 10 more degrees. Her face held a rigid composure, but her eyes were red, the skin beneath them strained. For all her sharpness, she looked exhausted, cornered by her own choices. Mark lingered in the middle, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, glancing between them as though waiting for someone to tell him where to stand. I stepped fully into the room and felt every gaze turn toward me. The weight of their expectations settled across my shoulders. At that moment, I understood something with startling clarity. No one else could decide what happened next. The house was mine. The memories were mine. The life built here, piece by piece, was mine. And yet, both of my children were pulling at pieces of me, each demanding a different version of what they believed was right. I could not follow both. A quiet steadiness rose inside me. It surprised me. It cut through the shock and hurt like a small but unwavering flame. I looked at Evan first, then Lydia, and then at the home around us. I thought of my husband, of the years we built this place, of the winters we endured, of the long evenings spent cooking, talking, arguing, and loving within these walls. His voice, so often remembered in quiet moments, surfaced again. He had once told me that a house was more than property. It was a living place shaped by the people who honored it. But honoring something did not mean allowing it to be taken. I took a breath, long and deep, letting it settle inside my chest before I spoke. The words came with a calmness I did not expect. I made it clear that the house would not be sold. Not now, not quietly, not through secret emails or behind closed-door conversations. It would remain mine as long as I had the strength to live in it. I explained that I would be contacting a lawyer to update my will and protect the home from any decisions made without my direct consent. It was not a threat. It was a boundary, one long overdue. The room shifted. Evan released a breath he had been holding. Mark lowered his gaze. Lydia's shoulders trembled almost imperceptibly. She looked at me with a mixture of shock and something softer, something wounded. The veneer of her composure cracked slightly, revealing a glimpse of vulnerability beneath the armor she wore so tightly. I added that I did not want to fight her, but I also would not allow her to speak to me only as an attorney crafting arguments. If she had fears, she needed to bring them to me as a daughter. If she needed help, she had to say so without burying her truth beneath cold logic. I told her I expected her to face me, not as someone she blamed for her burdens, but as the woman who raised her, loved her, and deserved honesty. Her bedroom door opened just a few inches. She did not step out. She did not speak, but she listened. And for now, that was enough. The quiet slowly returned, but it was different from the silence after the argument. It was no longer a void. It was the stillness that comes when a decision has finally been made. I walked back toward the kitchen, filled the kettle with water, and set it on the stove. The simple act grounded me. The steam slowly rising from the spout felt like the beginning of something shifting, something necessary. Tonight, there would be a conversation, a real one, and whatever came from it would shape the path ahead for all of us. If you're still here and ready to see how this emotional turning point shapes what comes next, drop a number 6 in the comments. Now let's step into Chapter 7. The cabin felt altered after my declaration, as if the temperature had dropped a few more degrees, despite the fire still breathing quietly in the hearth. The silence did not resemble peace. It was the kind of silence that blankets a room after something fragile has shattered, when no one quite knows how to move without stepping on the pieces. I could sense the shift in every corner of the house. Even the walls seemed to hold their breath. Lydia retreated to the guest room without a word, closing the door with a soft click that somehow sounded heavier than any slam. The quiet from behind that door unsettled me more than her raised voice earlier. When she was angry, she was sharp but familiar. This silence, though, held a depth I could not read. It felt like she was sitting alone with all the weight she had tried so hard to keep contained, and I did not know how to reach her without opening wounds that neither of us was ready to confront. Mark lingered in the hallway for several minutes before approaching me. His posture held apology even before he spoke, though his words were gentle and restrained. He explained that he had known Lydia was under pressure, but had not realized the extent of it, nor the desperation behind her actions. I listened, nodding slowly, but the ache in my chest did not soften. A part of me felt betrayed by the secrecy. Another part felt tired from carrying the emotional responsibility alone, and a quieter part recognized that he, too, had been swept into the undertow of her panic. Evan stayed close by my side through the morning, moving around the cabin with deliberate care, as if he understood exactly what I needed without my saying it. He fetched more firewood, checked the flue, and carried blankets from one room to another. His presence steadied me. There was a protective gentleness in the way he moved, a quiet offering of comfort that reminded me he had always worn his heart openly. Seeing the hurt in his eyes made my own grief feel heavier, because I knew he was mourning the state of our family just as deeply as ours. I retreated for a while to the small room that had once been my husband's workspace. The scent of old paper and cedar clung to the air, familiar and grounding. I straightened the books on the shelf, sorted through envelopes, and tried to restore a sense of order that the morning had taken from me. Yet no matter how many times I rearranged a stack of papers, the hollow feeling did not lift. The memory of Lydia's words lingered like a bruise. Each time I passed her closed door, my hand twitched with the impulse to knock, but I stopped myself. I knew she needed time, and forcing a conversation too soon might only deepen the divide. Still, the distance ached. I remembered her as a child who used to climb into my bed during thunderstorms, clinging to me as though the world outside might break apart. It was almost impossible to reconcile that memory with the woman now barricading herself behind silence and steel walls. The storm outside began to ease by late afternoon, the wind softening, the snow falling in gentler patterns. Inside, however, the tension remained unmoved. It settled into the space between us like a dense fog. The events of the morning had left cracks in the foundation of our family, cracks that could no longer be ignored. As night approached, I realized the confrontation had changed us all. We were no longer a family tiptoeing around unspoken worries. Everything was out in the open now, raw and exposed. But exposure alone could not heal anything. Something more had to follow, and I knew the next step would require courage, not from anger, but from love that refused to give up. Night settled over Lake Placid with a quiet softness, the kind that follows a heavy storm. The cabin, still bearing the weight of the morning's conflict, felt calmer, but not yet healed. The wind had eased, brushing gently against the windows, and the fire in the living room cast a steady glow across the floorboards. Even so, the emotional distance between us still hung in the air like a faint, lingering chill. I could sense the shift, the first signs that the storm inside our family had begun to lose its force. I stepped out onto the front porch, wrapping my shawl around my shoulders as the cold air stung my cheeks. The snow was no longer falling in frantic waves, but drifting lightly in slow spirals. The world outside looked softened, almost forgiving. I stood there for a few quiet minutes, breathing in the crisp air, letting my thoughts settle. The tension of the day still pressed against me, but beneath it was a faint thread of hope, small and delicate, yet unmistakably present. Footsteps behind me broke the silence. Lydia stood in the doorway, her posture less guarded than before, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. She looked smaller somehow, as if the weight she had been carrying had finally begun to collapse inward. Without saying anything, she stepped outside and sat on the far end of the porch bench. I lowered myself beside her, leaving just enough space to show respect for the fragility of the moment. For a while, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the faint creaking of the old porch boards beneath our weight. Then Lydia began to speak, her voice unsteady, admitting the truth she had been trying so desperately to outrun. She spoke of her fear, of the financial pressure that had spiraled beyond her control, of the shame that kept her from telling me the truth. She explained how the stress had twisted her thinking, making her cling to control wherever she could find it. Listening to her, I realized that beneath her sharp edges was a terrified woman trying to hold herself together. I let her speak until the words slowed. Then I gently shared my side. I told her about the ache of being dismissed, the sting of hearing her talk about selling the home that held every memory of the life her father and I built. I told her about the loneliness that grew stronger each year and how easily her words had shaken the ground beneath me. I had never spoken so openly to her about the grief I carried, the vulnerability that lived quietly inside me. Lydia's tears fell freely, her face crumpling in a way I had not seen since she was a child. She admitted she never meant to hurt me, only to solve what she thought was a looming disaster. She had approached the problem like an attorney rather than a daughter, forgetting that some things required tenderness rather than strategy. I placed my hand over hers. It was a simple gesture, but in that moment, it felt like a bridge forming across a widening gap. We agreed that her financial troubles would be faced together without sacrificing the home or the bond between us. When we finally rose from the bench, the air felt different, lighter. The path ahead was far from easy, but for the first time in a long time, we were standing on it side by side. If you're still watching and want to see how everything finally comes together, comment number 8, so I know you're with me until the end. Now, let's move into the conclusion of the story. The morning after our conversation arrived quietly, as if the cabin itself understood that the day needed a gentler beginning. When Lydia and I stepped back inside the previous night, the warmth from the fireplace had spread through the rooms, softening the edges of the tension that had once filled every corner. By sunrise, the house felt lighter, as though it had exhaled after holding its breath for far too long. I entered the kitchen to find Evan whisking eggs, Mark preparing bacon, and the children setting plates on the table with a kind of tentative enthusiasm. Lydia joined us a moment later, her expression tired but open. There was no heaviness in her movements this time, only the quiet humility of someone ready to rebuild what she had broken. We moved around each other gently, as if afraid to disturb the new balance forming in the air. When breakfast was ready, we gathered around the table. The simple meal felt richer than any feast from the night before. Lydia cleared her throat, and though she spoke softly, her words carried enough weight to still the entire room. She apologized for her actions, her voice unsteady as she acknowledged the fear and desperation that had driven her. The honesty in her tone made my chest tighten with a mix of sorrow and relief. Evan nodded slowly, and Mark placed a hand on her shoulder. The children watched silently, sensing the emotion even if they could not fully understand it. I accepted her apology, but I made sure to repeat what needed to be said. The house would remain mine. Decisions about my life and property would no longer be made without my consent. The boundary felt necessary, not out of punishment, but protection. Lydia listened intently, and when she nodded, I could see she understood more deeply than before. After breakfast, we went outside together. The storm had passed, leaving a blanket of fresh snow that sparkled in the pale light. We cleared the porch, shoveled pathways, and carried wood inside for the fire. The shared work felt symbolic, each small effort stitching our fractured bonds back together. Later, we gathered by the window with mugs of hot cocoa, watching the snow slowly melt from the branches. For the first time in a long while, I felt something steady inside me. We had not fixed everything, but we had stepped towards something better, something possible. And for now, that was enough. As afternoon settled gently over the cabin, I found a quiet moment to sit alone in the living room. The fire had burned down to a warm glow, and the soft orange light flickered across the walls in a calming rhythm. Outside the window, the last rays of daylight touched the snow, turning the landscape into a wash of pale gold. It was peaceful in a way that felt earned, as if the house itself acknowledged the storm we had weathered together. I let myself reflect on everything that had unfolded. The hurt, the shock, the confrontation, the truth finally pushed into the open. I understood now that loving my children did not mean losing myself in the process. It meant setting boundaries that honored both them and me. For years, I had mistaken silence for strength and sacrifice for connection. But this Christmas had shown me how easily love can warp when clarity is missing. My thoughts drifted to Lydia, to the fear behind her sharpness, to the pressure she carried alone. She had not meant to wound me, even if her choices had cut deeply. She had simply reached a breaking point and lost sight of the difference between solving a problem and hurting someone she loved. I could forgive that. I already had. The sound of laughter floated from the kitchen, light and genuine. When Lydia appeared in the doorway and asked if we could cook together next year, something in me softened further. I saw not the woman who had spoken harshly days before, but the daughter who still wanted her mother close. I smiled, knowing we were stepping into a new season of our lives, one shaped by honesty, respect, and the quiet courage to begin again. In the quiet that follows any storm, there is always a moment when the world feels strangely still, softened, humbled, and ready to begin again. Healing rarely arrives in grand gestures. It comes instead through the small acts of honesty, gentle boundaries, and the courage to see one another with clearer eyes. Families bend, fracture, and rebuild in countless ways. Yet what truly holds them together is not perfection, but the willingness to return, to listen, and to choose love even after it has been shaken. Winter reminds us that every frozen season carries the promise of thaw, and that forgiveness, offered or received, has its own quiet warmth. If this story touched something in you, I would love to hear your thoughts. Share a comment, follow the page, and subscribe for more stories that linger long after the last line. Your presence here truly matters.